Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video. And today I'm here with my husband Nick.
Hello.
And we're going to be talking about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Brontë. So Nick has just finished reading The Tenant of Wildfell Hall for the first time and we thought we'd have a chat about it. I think we're probably going to be spoilery in this video. Yeah, so if you haven't read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, don't watch this video. I think we had better do spoilers, because it's quite a hard book to discuss the themes of without some spoilers. So
I would also say read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall without being spoiled for it, because it's worth reading without knowing what's going on.
Yeah, you didn't know anything about it going in, did you?
Pretty much nothing at all.
So, what did you think of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall?
I thought it was really good, actually. I really enjoyed it. I think, I'm not sure whether it was better than Wuthering Heights. I think I probably prefer Wuthering Heights, but it's definitely up there. Very good book.
I mean, I feel like you declared Wuthering Heights to be like the greatest book ever written last year, so...
I mean, I don't think I would say that Wuthering Heights is the greatest book ever written.
I'll go back and watch the video we made on Wuthering Heights last year. I feel like you were very positive.
I think I was very positive. I might have said it was the greatest book ever written, but it isn't.
Yeah. So you obviously loved Wuthering Heights a lot last year, so that you think The Tenant of Wildfell Hall might be as good is high praise.
Yeah, I think it's on a level. It's a very different story, but also kind of quite a similar story. I mean, everyone's awful, but in a very different way to Wuthering Heights. I hate them all differently. I
think people in general seem to hate the characters in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall less than the characters in Wuthering Heights. But as we were talking about it is true that a lot of the characters in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall are quite questionable. I do often see people say that Brontë has less terrible taste in male heroes than her siblings. And that may be true of Agnes Grey, but I'm not sure that's true of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, because Gilbert is a piece of work, really.
Gilbert Malcolm is a paranoid sociopath. His only saving grace is that he is not an evil alcoholic.
He's better than Arthur Huntington.
He is better than Arthur Huntington, which is an extremely low bar to have cleared.
If you were to remove the bit where he viciously attacks Mr. Lawrence, I feel like he would be more like
force whips him in the face.
But that is quite a grim bit of the book.
There's the physical assault on an innocent character. Gilbert Malcolm is possessive, controlling, paranoid, and just basically delusional. I think he's an interesting character. I don't dislike it. I don't dislike reading about him, but actually, that's probably unfair in that he obviously goes through a bit of character development, and he's better by the end of the book than the beginning of the book. But right at the end of the book, he's like, Mr. Lawrence has been plotting against me and has been trying to sabotage my hopes. It's like, the man was organising his own wedding. He probably just wasn't thinking about you, Gilbert. Particularly given you've never mentioned that you'd quite like to marry his sister. It's just and he didn't read my mind and immediately arranged my marriage to his sister, even after I horsewhipped him in the face. And it's like...
Yeah, I think Gilbert is quite self-absorbed.
I completely believe he loves Helen. I completely believe that, and I find their love interesting and believable, and also more wholesome than, obviously, Heathcliff and Cassie's love is a deeply corrupting, basically evil force. And I feel like what I would say is different is that Gilbert Malcolm is somewhat redeemed by his love for Helen, rather than made worse. Yeah. Helen obviously is much more sympathetic by virtue of being the victim of some pretty horrific marital abuse. And I think that is really interesting in the book and quite unpleasant to read.
Yeah.
And it's interesting as well because it's all very psychological. I think he throws a book at her once, and he's not really throwing it at her, he just doesn't care whether it hits her. But actually, it's almost entirely psychological, which is wasn't really what I was expecting for a Victorian book.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to find that particular kind of abuse explored in a Victorian novel. I mean, to be honest, it's quite interesting and powerful, and in some ways surprising to find any kind of sort of abusive marriage explored in Victorian literature. But actually, the particular kind of abuse, especially, I think, is really interesting to see from that time.
It is, and I think actually there's a bit in the sort of Gilbert Malcolm section where the Reverend, I don't think we actually see him say it, I think he's reported to have said it, but basically says she shouldn't have left him. Actually, she should only have left him if she'd been physically abused, and actually only if quite badly physically abused.
Yeah, which is quite grim.
And even then, that she'd have done better to turn herself over to the law, basically. It's quite a shocking view into a different society's sort of views of what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable. Yeah. She's probably the closest thing the book comes to having an admirable character, in that she is unbroken by what Arthur tries to do to
Yeah.
her, and she has got an extreme inner strength, and she basically behaves well and correctly and morally nearly all of the time in the book, with one exception that we'll get to in a second. But basically, generally speaking, she's the only one who doesn't give in to their baser instincts, and that is admirable in its way. But she is extremely uncompromising and inflexible. Yeah. And I'm not saying she should have been flexible with Arthur, but I think generally speaking, she's a very rigid character. And there is a bit at the end where Arthur's like, "You've come to gloat," and she's like, "No, I haven't." It's like, "You have a bit though, haven't you?" Like, and I
don't think she has though. Well, I would disagree with that reading of her, because I think a lot of that is to do with a very rigid sense of duty. And I know we were talking about this when we were talking about the book after you finished it, but the Victorians had a very different view of marriage, and for Helen, one that is very bound up with religion. She entirely views herself as irrevocably tied to Arthur, and so she views it as her duty to go back and look after him when he's dying, in a way that I as a reader, I think, do find quite hard, because there's a bit of me that just thinks, well, you shouldn't go back and help him because of the way he treated you. And I think it's a very, very different mindset and a very different worldview that means Helen feels she must go back.
Yes, and I think that, we'll probably get onto that in a second, like the different sort of completely different cultural context is really interesting. But I think she derives personal satisfaction from behaving correctly. And I think there's a narrow line there, and I think you can debate whether she crosses it, basically. And I wouldn't say that's my reading of the character necessarily, but also I think it is there. You could read it as being there.
I do also think that she has spent her life around people who behave so terribly that it's very understandable that she would have some satisfaction about not behaving as terribly as everyone else.
I'm not saying it's not justified, but I think, and like I said, I don't think that's not the sort of conduct that the bit where I think she sort of gives into her baser instincts at all. I think it's just an interesting way of looking at the character. I think the bit that certainly for me is slightly unforgivable is where she poisons her child.
If you don't remember, if you have read the book but a long time ago, so her husband Arthur tries to get her son Arthur when he's like 3 to like alcohol, and gives him a lot of alcohol, and Helen, trying to get child Arthur off alcohol, gives him alcohol with poison in to make him sick, so that he associates alcohol with being sick.
It's an emetic, yeah. So I think,
which is quite grim.
It's interesting because I don't think the book invites us to judge her at all for that action.
No. And I do think in general, the Victorians' ideas about like child care and everything are very, very different. And also the Victorian ideas of medicine, you know, to bleed someone or to purge someone was not considered unpleasant in the way that we might think of it now. So I think there is a whole different context there between what she does, but it is also quite grim.
I completely understand why she does it, but I do think it's the one bit of the book where I'm not comfortable saying she behaves correctly in doing that. And also, I think it's a good example of rigidity. So I think she's very much wedded to her moral system, and things in that moral system are either right or they're wrong, and if they're wrong, they must not be done, regardless of whatever that might mean or cost.
Maybe she should have just run off with Gilbert. But even though you didn't like the characters, you did enjoy it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. So I think the book, for anyone who's forgotten, is split. It's the frame narrative. So it starts with almost a double frame narrative. It starts with, a bit like Wuthering Heights actually, it starts with Gilbert writing to someone saying, let me tell you my story, and then he writes some letters setting out like the beginning of the story, and then halfway through, probably a bit less than halfway through the book, he's like, and then I got hold of Helen's diary because she gave it to me, so like, here's her diary, which is then the bulk of the rest of the book, and then there's another, I think it's probably like another 20% quarter afterwards, where Gilbert's plot resolves. I enjoyed the first part. I think once I got into Helen's diary, I was really, really enjoying it. It's really harrowing, really. It's
a great exploration of the sort of sordid side of Victorian society. And I know we talked about this as well. I think in Wuthering Heights, everything is so wild that it feels more alien, whereas in the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, it's not wild and distant on the moors, it is drawing rooms and parlours, but actually everyone is behaving terribly. And actually this is not very far below the surface of Victorian polite society, that everyone is behaving in this sort of hedonistic way.
I have never read a Victorian book where the veneer of Victorianness is so broken. I found it's quite shocking and explicit. It was not at all what I was expecting for a Victorian book. I think there's a few bits where a modern book might go into a little bit more detail, but actually I don't think if you were sort of writing a modern retelling of this book, you would have to like recut it. It's quite upsetting when you read, particularly sort of because you have a sense that things have not gone well. Before the start of the Helen section, I had sort of roughly guessed what had gone on, because some of us might have read other books that might be inspired by the Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
No,
but I had a rough idea of what might have gone on, but it is pretty depressing to watch the diary entries. It's like, oh, I love him unconditionally, and I was like, oh, maybe he's not perfect, but I still love him. And then it's like, I shall try to make him better with my love, and then like, I just hate him. Like,
and I think the structure works really, really well, because you're following Helen as her life collapses in real time in her diary, but you also have you do know what happens afterwards, and you have sort of Gilbert's view of her from the outside first, and you see how lonely and isolated her position is in the beginning, having left her husband, as you find out later, and sort of all the gossip and tension that surrounds her when she's come to a new place, trying to build a new life. And I think that's really interesting. I also think that sort of frame narrative is a really interesting device in lots of Victorian novels, and it's interesting actually, both Wuthering Heights and the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, now we keep coming back to them a lot, but both of them have a woman's narrative within a man's narrative. So the book begins with a male voice, but then the bulk of the narrative is actually a woman telling a story, which I think is quite interesting within sort of ideas about what it was acceptable for women and men to write about in the Victorian period, especially considering all the Brontë sisters published under names that didn't reveal that they were women. And at the time, most people thought they were men. So it's quite interesting that their sort of outer frame narratives are a male voice, and then the sort of inner story is a woman's voice.
Well, smuggling a woman's voice in.
Which is quite interesting. And especially in The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which I think is a very proto-feminist book and is a lot about the position of women and the inequality of women within marriage, and the sort of the impossibility of getting out of marriage once you're in it, I suppose.
I agree with you to an extent that it's proto-feminist, but also the biggest impediment, I mean, obviously there are legal impediments and issues, but actually, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way, but Helen is trapped by her own beliefs about marriage. Like, it's not just that society says you're bound to him. It's that she spiritually believes that she's bound to him, and I found that really interesting, because I think it's just something that modern readers probably don't follow. The idea that you are indivisibly bound to someone who is so...
Yeah, even if they treat you that way. Yeah.
So obviously, whether Arthur is evil, I think, is an interesting separate discussion, but it's so obviously just a completely undeserving. Does he really marry her under false pretenses? But it's definitely not what she thought she was signing up for. And I think it's fascinating to see that sort of belief, and actually I think the discussions about sort of belief in general in the book are really interesting. I think there's a bit where Gilbert and Helen talk about when Helen's like, now you know that I'm married, obviously we can't be together, and Gilbert's like, oh, I suppose we can't, and then it's like, we'll meet in heaven, and then Gilbert's like, that'll be a bit rubbish, won't it? And she's like, maybe. A lot of us have this idea of like a Victorian conception of heaven as sort of like lots of sweet little cherubs, but otherwise basically it's it's just the country. But I think that idea that it's quite theologically complicated ideas about whether if all your sin is removed, whether you're still the same person, and like if you love everybody because you've achieved perfect love, like does that mean you're the same? And then I think again with Arthur, when Helen and he are talking about sort of hell, when he's dying, and he talks about hell, and he at one point he says it's a fairy story. Or a fable, I think he says specifically. And she's like, oh, can you afford to take that risk? And I don't think I've ever read another Victorian book that specifically doubts, or has a character specifically and so overtly doubt the existence of heaven and hell, and like, the sort of, I suppose, like the Christian belief system, in a way that I thought was really interesting. I mean, even like The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a book that is massively concerned with morality. Is Lord Henry an atheist, for instance? But equally, I don't think anyone ever explicitly says, oh, it's not true. Like,
and also Dorian Gray is sort of 60.
Yeah,
50 years after this. Like,
but
this
I don't think it goes as far.
Yeah,
Like, I don't. It's the only book. I was really quite surprised by that. Like,
yeah, I have read other Victorian books where such views are said. I have to keep a lookout.
obviously, not all the Victorians did believe. Like atheism.
No,
There are atheists, I think, before the Victorian period. It's also important to remember that obviously Arthur is not the hero of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, so it's not an expression of an idea that is presented positively at all. But I just thought it was really interesting to get a more three-dimensional view of how Victorians thought about like their faith and spirituality than I think any other book has given me.
Just coming back to the sort of proto-feminism in the book, the other thing I did want to say is I think Helen does view herself as bound to Arthur for life, to the extent that she can't marry or she can't run off with Gilbert. But she does leave Arthur, and she does try to build a life aside from Arthur. And mostly that is for the sake of her son rather than for the sake of herself. But even the very fact that she does take that step and that she leaves him is like a huge deal to be written about in the 1840s. And I think that is really fascinating and a really interesting element to the book, and also an element to the book that I think a lot of people find quite surprising as modern readers.
I completely take your point. I think it is obviously very interesting. And actually, you said, oh, she does it for the sake of Arthur, and she does. But actually, there's a bit where Mr. Lawrence, her brother, comes to visit her, and she's like, can I run away and live in your like garden shed? And he's like, only if it's absolutely desperate. And it's actually more him. Even, I think Mr. Lawrence is generally sort of sympathetic and tries to help, but also he's extremely reluctant to let her take that step. And it's only basically when he's having an affair, he's got a sort of trumped up pretend governess to have an affair with. Does she just do it for the child? Yes. But also, like, is the child the
way to justify
the easiest way to justify what she's doing? There is a really sad bit where she and her friend Millicent are sat like having a chat, and basically they're just like, it's all quite rubbish. Married, and it's actually genuinely very moving that it's just these people who have a sort of a particular social ideal that they've been told to aspire to all their lives, and the reality is awful.
And I think, so many Victorian novels end with marriage, and the happy ending for the heroine is marriage. And actually to have a book that is like, oh no, maybe marriage isn't always great, is in itself quite a big deal.
Obviously this novel doesn't shy away from what that's actually like if you've married an awful person. And
to have your identity and your independence stripped from you, and to have your behaviour sort of really constrained. And also because Arthur lives in a way that Helen finds repugnant and immoral, but she is forced into that world because she has no other choice because she's bound to him.
So other characters, we sort of talked about Mr. Lawrence already a bit, but I like Mr. Lawrence. He's fine. I mean, he's a bit nothingy, like he's sort of like, he forgives Gilbert for cutting his face open with a whip, so he's obviously not the strongest personality.
I'm not going to defend Gilbert for cutting his face open, but I think within the world and context of the book, Gilbert cuts his face open because he thinks that Helen is Mr. Lawrence's mistress, not realising that they are siblings, and thinks that Mr. Lawrence is a bad, immoral person who has, preyed on Helen's innocence. He is trying to defend her honour. So I think that is why Anne Brontë doesn't consider that a bad thing to do. But I think as a modern reader, it's so hard to not just be like, what the hell are you doing, Gilbert? That's not okay. That's not an okay thing to do.
So I am not...
The sudden violence of it is so grim.
I'm not sure I completely agree with you.
You think not?
In that I think... So basically because Gilbert thinks it's a bad thing to have done, afterwards,
it's true.
He goes back and he's like, and he's partly like, oh, what if he dies? And I don't want to be done for murder. But also like, it is actually, I think he's ashamed of what he's done. So actually, I think, which I suppose Arthur is never ashamed of anything he's done. So I suppose actually, if you're talking about like,
maybe an important thing is not just that he wouldn't do as bad, like he's not as bad as person as Arthur, but also he has a sense of morals that Arthur doesn't.
Like you say, it's chivalric violence. Like it's men behaving like proper men. Like, you know, yeah, but it is. It's like men defending women's honour and being like noble knights. Whereas Arthur is dissolute and corrupt.
Yeah.
Like he actually, like I say, he's not physically violent almost ever. Like he's drunk and debauched.
And psychologically.
Abusive.
Yeah. Whereas Gilbert's physically strong.
It's very interesting, I think, that...
there's a lot of very interesting stuff about Victorian gender within the Tenant of Wildfell Hall.
I don't think that's completely supported. So, you know, Mr. Grimsby, I think, dies in a brawl. And obviously, that while Arthur isn't physically abusive, but there is a scene where Mr. Hattersley, like, grabs Millicent and in public, and is quite... I don't think he hits her, but he sort of holds her in a way that's clearly hurting her.
Yeah.
And is quite physically intimidating. I found that almost the most uncomfortable scene when they're all just watching this man like physically abuse his wife, and it's horrible. But actually, Mr. Hattersley is presented as the less bad one, and so maybe that does tie into our argument. And actually, he by the end of the book, he's basically redeemed and sort of is like, I'll be a nice man now, and like you know, I find it fascinating.
Yeah, he gets to learn his lesson. And Arthur
goes
doesn't.
to hell.
Yeah.
Lord Loughborough. I find Lord Loughborough really interesting as well. In some respects, maybe Lord Loughborough is actually kind of like the male archetype that everyone should follow, or sort of what's presented as someone who overcomes temptation and sort of realises that they are on the path to self-destruction, and actually manages to overcome that, and even when extremely provoked, doesn't fall back into those habits. And actually, I think he's a really fascinating character, because he is quite annoying. Like, and I can see why people find him annoying, but also like he's actually probably in Helen's narrative, he's the only man in the entire book who's not a complete like monster, basically. And I do think there's a bit when he finds out that Lady Loughborough has been sort of fooling around with Arthur, that conversation that he and Helen have is really interesting, because he's angry, and he's angry with Helen for not telling him, and he's also the only character, I think possibly the only character in the book who ever is like, I'm angry, and then like reflects and decides that actually that wasn't the right thing to do and apologises, basically. Actually, he's basically the only character who is open-minded enough to decide that his sort of initial course of action wasn't the right one. I suppose Mr. Hattersley does as well, actually. I suppose Gilbert maybe starts off disliking Mrs. Graham.
Yeah, I think Gilbert does go on a journey and tries to become less judgmental over the course of the book. Like, I feel he's quite... No, you don't think so?
I don't
You've read
know.
more recently to me, but I also feel like you have a harsher judgment of everyone in the book than I do.
I feel like Gilbert... I wouldn't like to go for a drink with Gilbert at the beginning of the book, and I wouldn't like to go for a drink with Gilbert at the end of the book. I think, actually... I don't think he really does change. He just falls in love with Helen, and that, you know, like...
I don't know.
I think maybe he learns self-discipline a bit, like, in that he's less impulsive, etc. But I don't really think he's a fundamentally different character at the end of the book to the start of the book. I don't want to give the impression that I didn't like the book, because I really did, and I think even... I didn't massively like Gilbert. Like, I certainly wouldn't marry him, but that bit where he's rushing to the wedding... when he thinks that Helen's gone to marry Mr. Hargreave, it's quite good. You root for the relationship, and I believe in the relationship, and I think I think the other thing that's interesting, we can talk about, is Arthur actually evil, or is Arthur also failed by a society that's never told him no?
Within the book, there is criticism of Arthur as a person, but also there is criticism of the society that makes Arthur this very sort of upper class world that lets men do whatever they like, and that never censures them and gives them no rules, and gives them what they think is endless money to flitter away. And so actually Arthur is a product of his society in many ways, I think. Actually,
one of the things that's interesting, because Arthur's death is pretty grim. Like, the way he dies is very, and I think, again, like, the sort of sickness and illness and sort of lingering death, it felt very Victorian, but also very explicit in a way that I don't think I've read in any other Victorian books. So I suspect there are many other accounts in Victorian books that are more like that.
I think it's also an interesting depiction of what alcoholism does to your body, which I think is something you don't see that often in literature. You often see discussion of what alcoholism does to your mind and your behaviour, but not actually the fact that consuming that much alcohol does do a lot of damage to your body. And I think that is a really interesting element of the Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And the Brontë sisters' brother, Branwell, by all accounts, was an alcoholic and had a lot of problems with drink and drugs and did die young. And I think you can tell that Anne Brontë knew what that kind of lifestyle did to you.
But also, I think his death, to some extent, humanises him. Like, actually, it's very interesting because, you know, we've talked about the sort of how you can read Helen during his death, but actually, he is genuinely afraid.
And he is genuinely suffering.
Yeah. And there are moments where you can see maybe he's reaching to be someone better.
Yeah.
And he doesn't. I don't think he gets there. I think the book maybe leaves it ambiguous, but I don't think he actually does really have any sort of moral epiphany or any. I don't think he ultimately is able to comprehend the extent to which he's failed as a human being. It is grim to watch him suffer like that, and I don't think there's no Schadenfreude, even though the whole book, or the bulk of the book, is watching Arthur do these terrible things. Yeah. There's no pleasure in watching him suffer at the end, and I think. It's quite interesting because, actually, is Arthur lying to Helen at the beginning when he says, you know, I'm always very moderate, etc., or does he deteriorate? And I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah.
And actually, I don't think Arthur's a good man when Helen marries him, but I think that there are also, just as a sort of practice of Victorian marriage, they're a terrible match for each other.
Yeah, and they don't know each other, and that is another sort of social criticism point within the book, I suppose, is how often people in the Victorian period got married who just didn't know each other at all. Whereas Helen and Gilbert, by the end, have known each other and understood each other, and like he read her diary of like however many years of her life, and they have a proper understanding of each other as people. Yeah. So that you can imagine they might be happy together.
Well, I would say I agree, and I think they are a good match. But also there is the bit at the end where Helen's like, "Oh, I'm so glad you've come. Would you like to marry me?" And Gilbert's like, "I did not understand what you meant by this."
No, I think he's just in shock.
He's just very slow on the update. She gave me a rose and was like, "Would you take my love?" And he's like, "I did not understand what this meant."
Poor Gilbert.
I found the Mr. Hargrave subplot very interesting as well, because I think he's kind of there as this temptation for Helen. Like, actually, you could get your revenge. You could take something back and you could punish Arthur and maybe find sort of some illicit happiness of your own. And the sort of point of it is that she won't do it because it's wrong. Yeah. It's immoral from her perspective, regardless of what Arthur does. But also I find Mr. Hargrave interesting because if you ignore the sort of propositions of adultery, I don't think he ever actually does really do anything that suggests that his intentions aren't, like, if not noble, like that he does genuinely want to help Helen.
Yeah.
But I think the book presents him in a profoundly negative way. And I find it very interesting because I think you can read him as quite sinister and looking to take advantage of someone who's in a very vulnerable situation.
Or is he actually in a very similar position to Gilbert? It's just that he suggests a move that Gilbert doesn't.
Well, I think you could read Mr. Hargrave as the same as Gilbert, save for he will compromise his morals.
Yeah.
And Gilbert won't. But you could also, I think, read it as, you know, him trying to take advantage of someone vulnerable. And there's a bit where she's like, I can't go out when I see him coming because he won't go away. And, you know, she repeatedly tells him, go away, and he doesn't. Yeah. So I sort of incline toward a slightly more sinister view of Mr. Hargrave, but I think the book is quite ambiguous. He's a very ambiguous character in the book, who I find really interesting.
So far, you're doing well on the Brontes, so you've read Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and loved them both. Mm-hmm. So are you going to read Jane Eyre next, or are you going to be controversial and not?
The reason I haven't read Jane Eyre is because I have seen... I know the story of Jane Eyre in a way that I didn't... I knew some of the story of Wuthering Heights. I knew nothing about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, other than what may have made its way into other publications. But I have seen a stage play adaptation of Jane Eyre. Yeah. I think I've seen at least one, possibly two adaptations of Jane Eyre. I'm sure there's bits that have been cut out, etc. But I know the story of Jane Eyre.
I do think you'd find it interesting if you read it.
Yes, I'm sure I would, and I think it probably is the next one. I think if I do another Brontë next year, rather than
there's plenty of.
I'd like to read Barnaby Rudge. I'd like to read Bleak House.
I'm doing a read along with Bleak House next month. If you want to join.
I think the problem, because I do so much of my reading on audiobook, and then you look at it's like 200 hours.
No, it's not. It's only like 55 or something.
It's a lot. It's a lot of hours.
That's because you listen on 1 speed. If you listened on 1.3 speed, you'd be fine.
Well, that would be morally wrong. Let me know in the comments what you think my next Victorian read should be. Should it be Jane Eyre, or should I try something else?
Charlotte Brontë is probably the most famous Victorian author you haven't tried. I suppose you haven't tried any George Eliot, but I'm not going to suggest you do that unless you feel it burning as I should do so.
I mean, I kind of like to read George Eliot just to annoy you.
We could make quite a fun video if you actually really liked The Will and the Floss, but I don't think you will.
Like I said, I really enjoyed both Wuthering Heights and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, but I do feel like I'll enjoy Jane Eyre less, not because it's a less good book, but because actually part of what I've really enjoyed is not knowing what's going to happen exactly.
So you could read Villette or something instead by Charlotte Brontë.
But then it seems a bit perverse not to read Jane Eyre, really. But
it is famous for a reason.
Yeah. But yes, I think who knew the Brontës were good?
I mean, most people, like so many people knew that.
Yeah, I think you definitely actually reading... They are excellent, but you also get a profound sense of gloom. I think I find it really interesting because I can see, because people thought that they were actually all one writer, didn't they?
Yeah.
And I can see why, in that while they're quite different books, there is a pervasive sense of sort of, I don't know, there's a cloud over everyone.
There's a melancholy and a wildness and isn't everything quite bad? Isn't everything quite grim? Aren't people not very nice? Like, there is that feeling to all their books.
Because it's interesting, because actually the Tenant of Wildfell Hall basically does have and they all lived happily ever after at the end. But actually, it's still just quite gloomy.
Yeah. I think that is a tone to the Brontës. And I think, I feel like you can tell from their books that they were different writers who had a lot of shared experiences. Yeah. So thank you very much for watching. Let us know your thoughts on the Tenant of Wildfell Hall down in the comments. And we might be back soon with some Victorian poetry.
We'll see how we get.
Yes.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. Yeah. So thanks very much.
Got like 8 days left.
No. There's 5 days left of Victober.
Okay. Well, we've got like 5 days left then. There you go.
Yeah. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.